Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's Monday, and the Republic is still standing, although not by much, or so it seems. Hey, I don't know if you've had a chance to see the New York Times this morning. Others have begun to report about it, but there's a new poll out by Siena College and the New York Times. Ready for this? If the general election were held today, guess who'd get 300 electoral votes? And it's not Joe Biden, and it's not Vivek Ramaswamy, it's Donald Trump. A poll reported, and it's the top story in the New York Times this morning, voters in 5 battleground states. Well, that's what it says in print. I guess it's a little bit different online. Voters in 5 battlegrounds favor Trump over Biden. Here are the results.
They can't use battleground. They got to say critical because it leaves something to the imagination. What's critical mean?
Well, but why would they put that in print for we morons who can't really get accustomed to the digital era? You know, I have to read my print division each morning. But listen to this. In Nevada, Trump leads in the polls by 10 points over Joe Biden. In Georgia, Trump leads in the poll by 6 points over Biden. In Arizona, Trump leads in the poll by 5 points over Biden. In Michigan, it's a similar 5-point margin in favor of Trump. And in Pennsylvania, he's got a 4-point margin. The only state in which he's trailing Biden right now is in Wisconsin, and that's by 2 points. According to authors of the poll and the New York Times story, that would give Donald 300 votes in the Electoral College right now, enough to secure him a return to the White House. That's quite frankly paradoxical. If you were to look at events in the world at large, you would think that Donald Trump should be preparing for his commissary count in either a state prison in Georgia, a federal prison in Washington or Florida, or a debtor's prison if New York had one, based on the Letitia James case, where he, meaning Donald Trump, could testify as early today. And we'll say more about that in a moment, including the potential for a classic confrontation between Donald Trump and Judge Engoron. But let's focus on Georgia for a moment. Fannie Willis is all excited. She's flipped several of Trump's lawyers and gotten them to plead guilty to offenses, always in exchange for walks, and in exchange, in part, for their expected testimony against Donald Trump. Initially, the Donald's trial strategy there would have been advice of counsel. He was following their advice in pursuing a strategy designed to challenge electoral results he felt were infirm. Now these lawyers presumably are going to say, well, we never advised him. We had our reservations. Our guilty pleas prove it. I don't know if the voters care. Candidly, I don't know if I care. He was president in 2021. We were coming out of the wake of the COVID lockdowns. There were enormous numbers of absentee ballots flooding the country, and we were warned that there might be a partisan skewing in how the votes were counted, that Republicans were more likely to appear at the polls and Democrats were likely to rely more on absentee ballots. And the conspiracy theorists out there said, watch what will happen. Donald will win initially and the votes will be taken from him by the absentee ballots, and the focus on those absentee ballots then led to suspicions of fraud and accusations, some of them wild, of fraud. But how wild were they really? Look at what happened in my backyard just last week. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, a state court judge has ordered a new primary because they caught on film the vice chairman of the local Democratic town committee in Bridgeport stuffing ballot boxes in the primary. Now, the elections are tomorrow here in Connecticut, and it's Gomez, the insurgent, challenging incumbent convicted felon, Joe Ganim. And if Ganim loses and Gomez wins, then Gomez won't insist that there be a new primary because he'll got what he wanted, or he'll have gotten what he wants, that is, the office. If Ganim wins, then Gomez may insist on a new primary, thus invalidating the will of the people as expressed at least at the ballot box tomorrow. I mean, what in the hell is going on? I am more and more persuaded that we should have federal campaign or electoral standards that we should declare Tuesday, the first Tuesday in November, to be when elections are held, to be a national holiday. Everybody gets the day off of work, and you're expected to go in and vote. I mean, there are European countries that fine you if you don't vote. I don't know that we want to go that far necessarily, but if voting is important, it's important enough to be given a day off. It's important so that no one should have as a reason for not voting the fact that they have to go to work. And if you're going to try to use an absentee ballot, there should be a higher standard than currently exists. Do you have a certified letter or a letter rather from your doctor? Are you overseas because of some professional commitment, or whether that be a private or governmental conviction, you're in the armed forces. But other than that, I don't think we want a bunch of absentee ballots floating around there so that professional absentee ballot harvesters can gather them and do what they will with them, or perhaps fabricate them and stuff them in a box, as the Bridgeport Democratic Town Chairman did. If you want to promote respect for elections, for the rule of law, we should have uniform standards for the application of the privilege of voting. Everybody should be encouraged to vote. We should shut down, we should have a national holiday that day. I mean, we got holidays for everything else, Indigenous people and Juneteenth. Why not for voting? And have people turn up at the polling place. And when they turn up, I really don't know. I really don't know why I'm looking at Jacqueline's comment. She's roasted me. We'll talk more about that. I really don't know why we can't insist that people identify themselves. If if you want to buy liquor or cigarettes and you look young, you've got to produce identification. You want to get in an airplane, you want to produce identification. If you want to vote, why not produce identification? Now, let me address Jacqueline's criticism. Jacqueline is like, why did I have to mention he's a convicted felon? I guess that's just a little bit of snottiness on my part. I mean, the people of Bridgeport, he paid his time, he did his dues, and the people of Bridgeport returned him to office. He's done a fine job. But the fact of, and maybe that is the fact of the matter, that notwithstanding that felony conviction, the people chose. And maybe that's what's going to happen in Donald Trump's case. Maybe he will have a felony conviction or two by the time the general election comes around in November. But maybe it's not going to matter. Maybe it's just too easy to acquire a felony conviction in the best of all possible worlds. Jacqueline, I certainly didn't mean to hurt your feelings, and I've respected your support over time. But he has broken the law, and he has that scarlet F on his forehead. He is still the people's choice, and I still think the people can make that choice and should have the ability to do so. So let's keep track of what happens this week. I'm going to be particularly interested in the doings in Judge Engoron's courtroom. That's where he is the judge who is presiding over the civil fraud trial against Trump. Trump could take the witness stand as early today. And
Looks like we lost your audio, Norm. Unplug, replug, and then unmute once you've replugged that in. Ask me how I know what's going on, chat.
Hi, are you there?
Yeah, we're here.
I don't know what happened. I mean, I don't know what's going on with my machines these days. It's the deep state, folks. I'm telling you, they're out to silence. It's Judge Engoron's OG, who is accused by Trump and his lawyers of being a little too partisan. But Judge Engoron has been lawless in his application of gag orders. Gag orders are designed to assure the fair trial rights of trial participants. And if a person's speech undermines the right to that fair trial by intimidating a trial participant or otherwise tainting a jury pool, gag orders have been justified. Otherwise, they're not justified. So as to the hurt feelings and
there you go again. You're out again. Cannot hear you. Nope. It's okay. We got a slight delay, so they haven't heard that you're not here yet. Cannot hear you. You're muted. So I'm going to unmute you got to unmute your mic. There you go.
Having problems with the machine here today. I'm sorry, folks. I had a new microphone attached and it was working just fine.
And it sounded crisp. Sounded crisp too.
But it timed itself out. So I guess the gods have issued a gag order. Too much speech for Norm.
Your mic issued a gag order, according to Luttrell. I like that.
Well, I don't know, Judge Mike. But anyhow, Engoron's decision to impose a gag order is altogether lawless and unprecedented. Trying to silence Trump and his lawyers because they're making tart comments about his clerk. Seriously, Judge Engoron, that's a prior restraint on speech, and it's not justified by the standards that typically apply to a gag order. Those standards will be under examination in the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, where Judge Chetkin's gag order as to Trump has been stayed on grant of an emergency application for appeal in the appellate court. Argument is expected as early as November 20th on whether the judge was overbroad in her attempt to silence Donald Trump and his team in the wake of trial. I don't think Jack Smith should be worried about what Donald Trump has to say about him or his staff. And I think that publicly commenting on the fairness of the proceedings, the political nature of the proceedings, is altogether appropriate. Especially given the poll results in the New York Times. But I was thinking about Jack Smith in the middle of the night last night. I couldn't sleep. That's a bad sign. And I'm thinking, Jim Harbaugh, Jack Smith, and Greta Thunberg walk into a bar. I mean, if ever there were a comedic setup, that would be it. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. The janitor comes out and says, "Hey, folks, we're closed. You'll have to leave." Greta says, "We're all going to die. I want a drink. I demand a drink." Smith, "Guilty, guilty, guilty." Harbaugh, go blue. I mean, there's 3 pinballs in a broken machine. And then the janitor comes out, "You're going to have to leave." In walks David Hogg into this closed bar at 9 o'clock in the morning. Who would not, him? He's the kid from the Parkland shooting. You want to talk about people who've been given a bad draw in life? Even a mass shooter couldn't take him out. He wasn't even worth the attention of a mad shooter, but he falls in love with Greta. It's love at first sight. She says words that you'd never expect coming out of Greta's mouth. He's hot. He's hot. The chick, Miss Global Warming. Well, go figure. Even half shooters are entitled for love. Now the janitor is behind the bar. Drinks are on the house, he says, and they rename the bar the Spectrum because everybody can get on it. But I couldn't resist that crack about Jim Harbaugh and company. Forgive me. It's my failed attempt to be a stand-up comic.
Everybody needs something on a Monday morning.
Yeah. So I'll be traveling to Washington later today. There's a congressional hearing tomorrow. The House Judiciary Committee has a subcommittee that apparently is focusing on the conditions of confinement for January 6 detainees, both on a pretrial and post-trial basis. And there's some disturbing stuff going on. On a pretrial basis, Jake Lang is now in the hole indefinitely in solitary confinement, apparently because of his speech. On a post-trial basis, Owen Schroyer is still in solitary confinement at the Oakdale Federal Correctional Institution in Louisiana. You'll recall that Owen went in for a 60-day sentence a couple weeks ago. He did his week's COVID quarantine, came out, made a few phone calls, including one that was recorded and broadcast, where he talked about his great desire to get back on the air and his love of his fans and so forth. And they promptly put him in the lockup again. And I've written to the prison. I've asked for access to him. I've asked for some report on its status. They've acknowledged that I've been in communication, but thus far we have no information. I appeared on Jack Pozovic's Human Events last week to talk about it and asked others to call if they were aware of similar treatment for other January 6 defendants. Simon Gold called to talk about her client, a man named John Stroud. He's been in solitary, I think, for 2.5 months. And he, as a result of speech he made critical of the government and its treatment of January 6. The Proud Boys remain under harsher penal regimes and punitive treatment than is otherwise warranted by their charges. We think because the District of Columbia's prosecutor, the U.S. attorney in the district, it has his thumb on the scales, or his office has his thumb on the scales of the Bureau of Prisons. Joe Biggs was recently transported, his hands placed in painful box restraints that are inappropriate for travel use, according to manufacturer's specifications. His hands went numb. Whether he suffered neuropathy or permanent nerve damage is as yet unknown. Enrique Terrio has been held in restrictive conditions. Some of the men are being denied access to mail in the library. And when they challenge prison officials about this, they're told, hey, it's because this domestic terrorism thing. Or with respect to Dominic Pizzola, it's because you couldn't shut your mouth. You'll recall Pizzola, as he was being led out of the courthouse after his sentencing, turned to the crowd and with a raised fist said, "Trump won. You all know it." There's a group selling those T-shirts. Trump won, and you all know it. He's now being penalized as a result of that speech by the Bureau of Prisons. On behalf of Condemned USA, we'll be writing a cease and desist letter to the Bureau of Prisons today with a courtesy copy to none other than the Inspector Javert of the Justice Department, Merrick Garland, asking for an inquiry into whether these men are being more severely treated because of their political affiliations. Gold Star Connecticut asks, am I speaking tomorrow? No, I'm not on the witness list for the hearing. If somebody wants to put me on it, that would be one thing. We will have a press conference earlier in the day to draw attention to the plight of these men. And I am appealing now to listeners. If you know a person or have a loved one who was arrested as a result of January 6th, participating in that riot that day, and is either incarcerated prior to trial or post-trial, and you have reason to believe that they're suffering more severe penal consequences, let us know. I'll put you in touch with Condemned USA, and we intend to make an issue of it if we can. It's hard to do, though, because under federal law, under the restraints of the Prison Litigation Reform Act, if a prisoner wants to make a complaint about the conditions of confinement, they must first launch an administrative complaint within the agency. In other words, you got to put a fox in the chicken coop and say, protect the chicks, But once that process is exhausted, you can go to court, and then you have to show that you had a right that was clearly established that has been abridged, and you'll face another obstacle in the form of qualified immunity, which will shield prison officials from liability in almost all cases. So, prison is obviously a place of confinement, and it's a place of punishment. But the promise of equal protection of the law says that similarly situated people are treated the same way. And some people shouldn't be punished more harshly because of their political affiliations than others are. And yet it appears, based on the gathering evidence, that that's exactly what's going on in the Bureau of Prisons right now. It's pretty disturbing. While we are on the topic of free speech and disturbing, Mike, big doings outside the White House this weekend. What happened?
I think you sent me an article from the New York Post, Norm, and the title of that was that thousands of pro-Palestinian marchers descend upon the White House chanting "Allahu Akbar, fuck Joe Biden" as they demand a ceasefire. And I'm going to put this on the screen here. And what I've seen in response to this article, as one might imagine, is a whole lot of insurrection happening without or seemingly with very little consequence. And the contrast between the pressure that was applied by the federal government, Federal Department of Justice, in the moments just after January 6, 2021, and what appears to be growing here at home in an unsettling manner.
Well, yes and no. This is a tough call for a civil libertarian because, I have defended the Proud Boys' right to speak on grounds that they had a right to petition for redress of grievances, a right to assemble, peaceably to assemble, and a right to speak out. And similarly, I believe the pro-Palestinian marchers also have that right. Now, to the degree that events on January 6th evolved in such a way as to result in violence at the Capitol, people were prosecuted. Whether they were over-prosecuted, I think they were. Apparently, with respect to events in Washington over the weekend, there's only been one arrest. Now it's not clear that the level of violence that took place at these protests approached that of what took place on January 6th at the Capitol. And it's also worth noting that on January 6th, the electoral votes were being counted. And according to the government, there was an effort to derail the peaceful transfer of power. I'm not sure that what happened at the Capitol this past weekend compares. Even so, I'm hard pressed to stand. I certainly don't support these protesters. I support their right to protest, and would defend their right to do so. But I think if there were ever several hundred, if ignorance is bliss, this was the happiest group of protesters in America in recent days. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Hey, Allahu Akbar. Let's drive Israel into the sea. This amid a rising scourge of anti-Semitism, I find to be altogether chilling. And, the notion that we've got protesters storming the White House saying Allahu Akbar doesn't do my Islamophobia any good. There is something called Western civilization, and it is worth defending. There is a Judeo-Christian tradition. The state of Israel was created the modern state of Israel was created in 1948 by the United Nations after the dissolution of the British Mandate. And let's never forget for one moment that in May 1948, when Israel was created, there were also provisions there for a Palestinian state to arise from the remains of the British Mandate. But rather than seeking to build a state and to build a nation, the Palestinians joined with the Arab world and vowed to drive Israel into the sea. And the rest, as we would say, is history. For the past 75 years, there has never been a serious effort on the part of the Arab world to accommodate this modern state. The Palestinian people have been used as pawns in little more than an anti-Semitic and apparently pro-Muslim desire to extinguish difference in the Middle East. I view Israel as an ally, as a necessary ally to the West. I view Western civilization as worth defending. And I note, Mike, with great interest this weekend, the amount of not funny, but hysteria-ridden ink I saw spilled on Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, and the emerging threat of Christian nationalism. I mean, what are we going to do? Strike "In God We Trust," from the dollar bill and replace it with Allahu Akbar? I just don't think so. I think that there is a Western tradition that's worth defending, and there's no shame in asserting and acknowledging that the United States of America was created on Judeo-Christian principles. And so an attack on Israel strikes me as an attack on the West. It strikes me as an attack on the values that sustain Western civilization in the United States. And the notion that, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 people saw fit to march on the White House, shake its gates, accuse Joe Biden of genocide, demand that Israel die while chanting Allahu Akbar. This makes me feel like a stranger in my own home. And it's not a feeling that I'm comfortable with. And in the name of pluralism, I will listen. But nothing requires me to accept or welcome this speech. In fact, I'm entitled to my own free speech and my own opinions and my own suggestion that this is a scourge on the American body politic, and that the generational divide that separates people over 30 and under 30 has now tilted. There was a fun column by Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal this past weekend that says, when we, Mike, of a certain generation, were coming up in the 60s and 70s, it said, don't trust anybody over 30. This was a sign of the youth movement and the generational divide. Peggy now wonders, should we trust anyone under 30? Are these kids sort of lawless, rootless, automatons that gravitate toward the latest rage and the latest grievance and the latest sense of entitlement to disrupt the world in the name of just what? I don't know. History repeats itself. This sign says Israel equals Nazis. I mean, that's the sort of stupid moral equivalence that is simply intolerable in a civil society. If that young man or woman truly believes that Israel equals Nazis. What do they make of the Hamas attack on October 7th? The beheading of civilians, the raping of women, the kidnapping of children. Do we forget that? Do we say that that was justified? That these are freedom fighters and that they can do anything to get what they want? That summarizes the modern era. And that sign to me is repugnant. I was in touch with Jewish campus leaders at Yale late last week. Yale being in the shadow of my office, or my office, more to the point, being in the shadow of Yale, to discuss a disturbing tendency of people to feel comfortable expressing anti-Semitism on that campus. And what do we have to do to comment or to combat it? And the suggestion was, Norm, you need to write something, as though that's going to help. But I do think we need to stand up and stand out. And candidly, I unapologetically stand with Israel. I think that Hamas and the violence on the Gaza Strip is truly tragic right now, but Israel has every right to exterminate Hamas. And the people of the Gaza Strip should be focusing less on Israel and more on the leadership of Hamas, which is using the civilians there as smokescreens. I think Netanyahu is right. Return the hostages and we'll talk about a ceasefire. But until then, are we really going to take our foot off the gas and give Hamas the chance to repair its tunnels, the chance to consolidate and once again make a strike across the border so that it can behead more children, rape more women? These people are animals. And this is not civilized behavior. And Israel has every right to react forcefully. I realize that this may be a little bit more support for Israel than some of you are comfortable with. I can't help myself in this instance. I think that what makes the West great are its ideals, and its ideals began to take root in Israel, spread through Greece and Rome in a different tradition. The two melded, and here we are. Dawn.
Elon Musk appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast late last week, and I do commend that podcast. It's obviously a long form, but I commend that podcast to all of our viewers and listeners on, and to think as you're listening to much of what Elon discusses. Joe poses the question to him, how much would you have paid for the acquisition of Twitter? How much was it worth? And the context for that is ultimately the recognition that X, as it's now known, is the one social media platform available that is not completely captured anymore, but it was at one time. It was, as Elon says on the podcast, it was an arm of the regime. Essentially, it was an arm of the federal government. And the reason I commend it is because it's really important to understand that as we begin to analyze the divide between those of varying ages. I see over on Rumble, Jackson says that everyone under 30 is living in a flash mob of stupid. That certainly
That's really well put. Yeah.
Well, but here's the problem with that. Whether it's stupid or not, it's still here, right? The ability for what's going on in the Middle East to metastasize in real time is a phenomenon that I think many people are overlooking because of how stupid it's perceived to be. But the reality is very simple, and it is that social media as a tool has been piping in, as Elon would say, has been piping in the tenets of Marxism, the tenets of communism. And this is in this sort of collectivization of individual rights and interests is the natural iteration of things. But we've never had a tool or a weapon like social media before. So again, just to pull back a little more, the analysis, in my opinion, aside from the substantive sides of this argument, right? We have people in the chat, Justin, saying that Egypt needs to step up. There are all sorts of geopolitical opinions to be had on this front, and I'm not running from that. But what continues to be important to me is that we are in America. I am an American, and ultimately, what concerns me about what's happening here is that our young people and the country's elders are at complete odds because they misunderstand one another. And the only generation that's going to be around to effectuate its will longer is the younger generation, right? So we've got to figure out a way to bridge this divide. So I do commend that. Norm, I'll send you a couple of timestamps for you to listen in.
I'd love to. Jason or Justin, rather, we tolerated the BLM summer. Is there a difference to you? You know, Justin, some of us tolerated it. Some of us protested. I protested. I thought the reaction to George Floyd was ridiculous. I mean, we've got a fentanyl addict passing a $20 bill who can't follow simple law enforcement instructions and couldn't breathe when he was sitting up straight in his car. An officer detained him. He died. It wasn't murder. It might have been excessive force. The notion that the country erupted to make a saint out of George Floyd, and that Floyd's family was paid $27 million for this would seem like something out of a Saturday Night Live skit. And I don't think the country has recovered. What's going on with respect to the glorification and support of Hamas now by the younger generation, I think is intolerable. So I will support their right to speak and to come out and protest. Candidly, I like it. It's like turning the lights out at night so the cockroaches can come out. And then you turn the light on and you talk to them and you zap them and you say, do you really believe that beheading is civilized? Do you really believe that Hamas gets a pass by hiding behind civilians? Is this really the world you want? And if it's the world they want, well, then we got a problem on our hands, and there's a fight to come, and let's see what shape that form takes.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah.
Takes.
And this is something. This topic in particular has really gotten the Rumble chat going, and I love what I'm reading back and forth. This is productive dialogue, despite what some of you might think right now, but. You know, the comment that everyone under 30 is living in a flash mob of stupid, I think really was the catalyst for the discussion. But there's a lot there. And I want to stay on this because I do believe, Norm, that the saving grace of all this is our ability to recognize how varying interests globally are deploying their will by using our own infrastructure here in America. And right now, it's clear that young people have, in general, most young people have no grip or command of the tenets or the moral fabric of the beginnings of America, right? Those founding ideals. And we are running very, very quickly away from those to solve whatever perceived ills that we think we can solve as this shining city on a hill.
And not just the foundation of America, but the foundation of Western civilization, the notion of accountability, of individualism, of worth, of freedom of expression, of respect for ideals, of tragedy, of the notion of sin, the need for redemption, limited government, humility as people. The fact that something isn't good just because you want it, that what you want may be infirm, and that what you want, if it's going to be a collective good, has to be reasoned about and a consensus arrived at. That violence is not the solution. You know, these are ideas that used to go under the rubric of Western civilization, but of course now we're taught that Western civilization is bad and we're oppressors and everybody needs to be freed from us. But note the following: you know, we're bad, but everybody wants to migrate here, and we want everybody to come here because why? We're bad. You know, the level of hypocrisy of just outright crazy out there in the world is overwhelming. I want to respond to a note from Dawn McNeil. Dawn, we issued a challenge to you because we know you're trained as a sociologist to translate Milbank for us. We talked about an essay of his last week that in the new criteria that was a little bit impenetrable, and I guess you did send us a writing on it. I haven't seen it. Mike's going to pass it along today. But you know, it's Milbank, the West, the last civilization, is in a lingering state of disintegration. I think that's true. Truth is severed from reality, and a will to unmoored power individually and collectively, progressivism. In other words, the point is that we used to have a shared consensus about the meaning of the world and its broader architecture. Now we take that broader architecture as a sign of oppression, and we've decided we need to overthrow it in the name of freedom. And that freedom is expressive. Each person has an independent value equal to everyone else's, regardless of what it is they're expressing. The result is transgender story hour and the inability to decide which restroom people should use. These aren't serious discussions for people seriously engaged in the business of understanding reality. They're the 2-year-old's tantrum, which we are adopting as the standard for evaluating everything that goes on in our world. And hence, it should be no surprise that this world is at risk of coming apart at the seams. This is a crisis moment of cultural history, and I think you need to decide where you stand. I stand personally with Israel. I stand with Western civilization. I am a Western chauvinist, and I refuse to apologize for the creation of the Western world or modern civilization. If you've got a problem with that, bring it. Let's talk.
In my personal position on this is I think that's a false binary norm, and I think that will become clear in time. But
Right.
the reality of what we're witnessing here, and the I don't know what we want to call in the cultural war that we are fighting, the realities of what's going on in Gaza. The people who are protesting now were already protesting here, but they weren't protesting about the treatment of Palestinians in the Middle East. They were protesting about the definition of a man and a woman, and who was allowed in whose restrooms, and who was allowed to compete in women's sports. Those are the same people
That's really true.
largely speaking. So I think this is a very complex issue, and we should endeavor to understand it. I think it's a false binary to say one or the other. There is a group of people who fundamentally understand that America has been subverted for the ideals that it began on. And Americans, me and you, Norm, have largely lost our position because we have catered to those who want to be held unaccountable.
We haven't lost our position. The New York Times suggests that there's a silent majority out there of people who are waking up and who are fed up. That's why in the 5 battleground states that favor Trump over Biden, people are saying, hey, he may not be perfect, but he's better than he's better than Sleepy Joe and his new rock band, the Identitarians, who are tearing the country apart. But let's keep at it, Mike. There's something going on out there, and it's certainly worth figuring out.
So we've got Julian. I am a Western chauvinist too. Angry Dogs says, I have no problem with that, Mr. Pattis.
Well, we'll see.
I enjoy peeling this stuff back, but I did need to at least say that I do see that Israel versus Palestine is a false binary for Americans. There's a lot layered there that we need to peel back and make right.
Yes and no. I mean, from my perspective, the events of October 7th gave Israel every right to respond with force, and it's given Hamas an opportunity to stand back and to provide the people of the Gaza Strip with relief from the violence that is to come. Do not use the people of the Gaza Strip as a shield, and return the hostages, and we can talk. If you refuse to talk, there are going to be consequences, and they are going to be violent. Israel has no duty to stand by while a cancer metastasizes on its border.
Well, and here domestically, we have to be prepared to react productively to that, because what's going on, we are inextricably intertwined with the results of what's going on there, for better or for worse. But we've got to be very, what I mean? So that's the issue. All right,
folks. Well, listen, tomorrow I will report from the swamp, where I'll be back in DC, holed up in a hotel room. And I can guarantee you this, the audio quality of my presentation won't be any worse than it was today, with the mic failing and having to go from a decent mic back to the computer. But we'll keep at it, and we'll figure it out. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening in. Contact your congressman if you know a J6 defendant who is locked up, and ask him to look in on this person. I think the Bureau of Prisons now has 2 classes of prisoners. There are those who are there as a result of systemic racism and deserve every consideration, and then there are the white supremacists who deserve an extra dollop of punishment. If you buy that narrative, listen somewhere else, or continue to listen in, and we'll persuade you that you're wrong.
We are here every morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. We've got more comments coming through, but I'm really your appearance on Jack Posovic's show last week, Norm, has done a tremendous service to us. And thank you to all the new viewers, but thank you most importantly to those of you who have been around and who know this is nothing new. Great to see you all. Justin, thank you. Julian, thank you. Jacqueline P., you have a wonderful day. I think I'm maybe on a 6-game slide here after tonight, everyone. I don't know. Anyway, Norm, see you tomorrow.
Yep.